Ladies and gentlemen and assembled company, welcome to the World Storytelling Cafe and our Monday night, Connecting the World by Story. And this week, we are going to explore storytelling beyond spoken language. And I'll say no more, or else I'll get a slap. And so I'm going to, the whole discussion is going to be chaired by Justine Demir. I've worked with for 1,000 years, well, despite the fact she's not more than 16 years old. And and so, Justine, would you like to introduce the whole thing?
Absolutely, I would. As John said, the title for this evening is Storytelling Beyond Language. And really, it's because when John and I were talking about, what would you like the session to be about? It's about how we are oral storytellers, so spoken language is kind of our stock in trade. So there's a big question about how we make our stories inclusive for people for whom spoken language itself is a barrier. And there's lots of reasons why that might be. It might be that the language that we're speaking is not somebody else's first language. There may be a translation issue. It might be if you're storytelling to very small children that are pre-verbal that don't have language yet. It may be that they haven't got access for the language because of that. It may be that you have non-verbal people for various kind of disabilities who also find hearing spoken language hard. Not to assume that people who don't speak can't understand. Obviously that's a slightly different thing, but there may be a number of reasons why that's an issue. And obviously for the deaf community, spoken language is not their first language. So there's lots of reasons why what is kind of the stock in trade of what we do can actually be a barrier for some people. So really tonight is just about kind of exploring that and how can we include those people and what is there in the spoken language, what can we add, what is there stuff we need to take away, is there something that we can change, what can we do so that we're including all of those communities as well. So this kind of mostly going to be a talking shop. I'm just going to ask each of our panelists, because we have a panel here of people who have different experiences around this, to just kind of introduce yourself, say your name, and just kind of one line about what your relationship with storytelling beyond language is. So who should we get? Sheila, do you want to go first? So if you just say who you
Sure.
are and just
Hi, my name is Sheila Arnold. Where I am is hot, so you'll see me glisten a little bit every now and
Ah,
then. That's just what you'll have to deal with.
Real
I
women blow.
I live in United over in Virginia in the United States, and I forgot what your question was. You just asked me to tell a little bit about myself, right?
so yeah, just literally just one line, because we'll go into more detail later, but just kind of one line about your
So,
relationship.
and then I've been storytelling since 2003 and am enjoying online storytelling as much, not as much, but actually enjoying it as well as, going live one day.
Brilliant stuff. Thank you. Nana, would you like to just do a quick intro?
Yep, so my name is Nana Timova. I'm a storyteller living in Lewes, near Brighton, south of England. I've been a storyteller for 2 to 3 years, so relatively new. And most of my stories are in English, although English technically is the third language I learned.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. David, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hey there, David Thompson here. I've been telling for over 45 something years now. And my experience with communication barriers is that I was a medical social worker and I had several people on my caseload. One was deafblind, and some of the others had basically a very severe form of cerebral palsy. And I was able to understand because I have a family member, well, she's dead now, a family member who has cerebral palsy, and I was able to understand her. So I've used storytelling with the disabled community here in Austin.
That's brilliant. Thank you. And Sarah, if you could just introduce yourself, that'd be great.
So I'm Sarah Lloyd Winder, and I started life as a dancer, and I think I still think of myself as a dancer first. And dancers don't speak, so you run around inventing ways to tell people what's happening. And the first theatre piece I did, all we had was a boo and hiss board and gratuitously large suggestions of what Yeah, it was basically somebody stole the cake, and we used a lot of music and dance. So that's where I started storytelling quite a while ago.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go back to all of you kind of and hear a little bit more about kind of those. But John said maybe I should talk about, to begin with, how, where my interest in storytelling beyond language came from. So I actually became a storyteller after doing a project with a lovely company called Oily Cart, who make work for pre-verbal and non-verbal audiences. And that was the first time that I met like a real live professional storyteller. And the first time I kind of thought, oh, I could do that. So I actually kind of came into storytelling at a place of doing stuff for kind of audiences for whom spoken language was a barrier. And after that project, I kind of met a friend that I'd met on that course in a cafe in Woodbridge where I live, and said, "Do you know what? I think I want to be a storyteller. I think I am a storyteller." And she went, "That's great. I'll pay you this much to come and tell stories for my local group." So as the words came out of my mouth, I had my first job. So I felt like I was probably along the right lines. And interestingly, it was with an autistic group. Now, at that time, I didn't know I was autistic. I don't think I knew at that time any of my children were autistic. We all are, but I had been working with autistic kids for a long time. And in that group, there were kids who didn't have kind of access to spoken language. So I think from the very start of my storytelling, I have often been working with audiences that don't have access to spoken language. And I specialised quite a lot in under fives. So I was always looking for ways of making stories more relevant to them, introducing different senses. Certainly a lot of my early work in storytelling kind of around kind of between 2008, 2012, I created a thing called Story Playtime. And Story Playtime is a session that kind of builds up to a story. So we play games and sing songs so that they kind of have actions and rhythms that are then used in the storytelling at the end. So all the way through, and that was, as I say, sometimes from kind of babies who had literally no language at all. So all the way through that, I've been thinking about how do we access, how do we make work that everybody can relate to. I then went on to work for a company called Bag Books as a trainer for librarians in how to tell multi-sensory stories. Don't know if people have come across Bag Books. They make, in fact, I've got one of these here. So you kind of get, I'm going to show you because they've got amazing stuff in them. Bag Books are things that come in boxes like this. There we go. Oh. And in these boxes, they have a variety of things. This particular story is called Kofi and the Magic Shaker. So they would have the children sat in kind of a horseshoe, and it was often for children that had profound and multiple learning difficulties, various physical issues, and there would be things that they would physically feel or smell. So this is Kofi's shirt. So you could put that around everybody. This is one of my favourite things. There's a part in the story when the birds come down around the main character Kofi, so you can do this around there. And then there's shakers. Also, I'm going to use this one. Sheila, you might be able to feel this from there. There was a fan.
Yes.
So they are absolutely lovely stories, and I think again that opened my eyes to what could be done. Telling you how old it is, it also came with music on a tape. So I had to find a tape player to play it. I think you can get them on MP3s now. But that notion of, I was working almost entirely with audiences that had no obvious language, and finding different ways of what responses might be to that. And I think, so I suppose that's kind of where I'm at. And so my idea is that when I'm telling stories, I'm always thinking about who in the audience that I might not know, because John and I sit in fields and tell to whoever comes along. If I'm telling in a pub, it's whoever happens to be there, and I don't know what their access needs might be. So it's trying to find ways within stories to bring things in so that everybody can experience the story in some way, and that kind of that remains my focus, I think. And obviously now so I realise I'm autistic. I have autistic non-speaking friends. My youngest child is non-verbal, so finding ways to engage with her with story. A lot of that is about touch. We do the billy goat scruff entirely by physical touch, and she will sit through all of that in a way that she won't often sit through a book Well, she will sit through a book. She'll just normally eat it halfway through. So I found that food is important with stories for my youngest. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So it would be really great, having had kind of a little intro to you guys. Maybe we can go around again and just say a bit more about what you do and how you've managed to kind of engage audiences that, as I say, spoken language is that kind of barrier for them. Does any brave soul want to go first? Or
Can I, after Sheila, can I come in at the end with a, you know?
Shall we allow him? What do you think?
Yeah, just,
Go
you
on.
know, after you've all been round. I know Baden don't want me.
Sheila.
Well, it's very interesting that at this particular time, I've been asked to come and join this, since I have just newly been learning to become a differently abled ally, based on a friend who has always spoken about her spina bifida and really shares that well. And I and was thinking that maybe she was pigeonholed and she couldn't, you know, she was just going to be the only person telling stories about differently abled people. And I thought, that's really important, because I don't know those stories and I can't be an ally till I know. So it's just, the timing is really good for me, for one. But I find that one of the things that I have gotten to do that I love is using this face and these hands and gestures, using my bodies in ways, because, you know, I love being able to do that. And so my quick little story, I suppose, is just being over in Israel and having dinner with a family that was a Muslim family. And pretty much everybody in the family spoke English except for their son, who was in second grade. And he didn't speak much English. He was going to an American school, but he didn't speak much English. And he was going to a Christian school even, so he didn't speak much English. But his parents, being good parents, had him tell us, you know, come up and show his vocabulary words. You know, every child's absolute, please don't do this to me, you know? And so they make him come up and say the English words, and he goes, cat, hat, that, you know, so he does that, and we're just applauding for him, my friends and I that are there, and he is absolutely mortified, okay, because he's just like, I'm second grade, get me out of this world, which is just lovely. And I said, oh, I want to share something. Well, he doesn't know English enough to know what I'm saying. And I start to sing, and I sing the Bumblebee Song, which is, I'm playing with my baby Bumblebee, and I do this with kids everywhere I go. And I said, well, I'm hoping it works with him. And so I'm doing the song, and I go, zzz, and I look at him, zzz. Oh, and so he gets it, and he puts his finger up. And so then we do this entire song, which is all in English that I'm doing it. But it has hand motions, and I'm making everything big so that he can jump in with me. And then we get to the end. The song is incredible because you get to throw up in the middle of it. It's absolutely wonderful. Well, you get to eat the bee, you get to throw up the bee, you get to sweep up the bee. It's a wonderful. And at the end, you go get another bee to play with. It's lovely. And so we do the whole song, and he loves it. And he has to do it again. And it was just this entrance into another world that we had that changed the way the whole dynamic of even the family worked with me after that. The willingness to find a way into the door. And I think that is what I'm always looking at my audience and going, what's the way into the door? If I have a child in the back who's making noise, can I bring that noise up front? Can I bring that noise into my story in a way, or it sounds like noise to me, but it might be talking to him. Can I bring those comments into a program just like I do with people who I understand what their comments are? Can I say, I agree, you are exactly right about that. That's exactly where we were. And I think that for me is what I find is looking at my audience, every one of them, and trying to find their place, and then using my face and my hands and my body to hopefully translate what I'm trying to say. Probably a long answer. Sorry, Justine.
That's great. And I think that there is that thing, isn't there? The thing that I love about storytelling is that it's completely, you are tailoring everything that you do for whoever you happen to find in front of you. And I think that is really key of like, whatever your audience are giving you, whether you understand that or not, that needs to be part of the story in whatever way, you know, just kind of being included. It's I find that sometimes storytelling in schools, and I do this interactive storytelling where, you know, we call it extreme storytelling, and they can shout out stuff and it goes straight into the story. And I often find that, I don't know if you guys find that when teachers will say to me, I never knew that kid could be creative, you know.
Yes.
And one teacher went to me, you just say yes to everything. I went, yeah. It's like, whatever it is, that's what I do. And they're kind of amazed by the power of that. But like you say, whatever it is, you don't need to understand it, but actually including it is just so powerful, I think, for the listeners.
You're being very polite, Justin. Usually you put all that in one line and you go, it's the audience, stupid.
Yeah, but you know, if I did that in one line, I'm not even. John knows that my theory of audience is serve your audience. It's like there's just a stronger word in there, which I won't do for polite company, but yes, that's basically. Nana, would you like to say a little bit about where kind of your experience is coming into this and your thoughts around it?
Sure. So my experiences has more of a personal experience. So my background is I travelled a lot when I was a child. So my dad is in the sciences. So we moved from Bulgaria to France when I was 10, and I knew bonjour, and that was about it. So I spent a couple of years, one in primary school, the second one in secondary school, not understanding a single word. So it's and whenever I tell a story, it brings me back to that time where actually I was, you know, felt completely unrelated to anybody else and outside of the community and outside everything. And just when I learned French to a decent level to be able to speak, we moved to England, and the whole story repeated itself. So I know I couldn't really speak much English. So kind of knowing from experience, that was much better. So for me, as Sheila said, you know, the facial expressions are so different, and thinking about different countries and people who live in those countries, how the facial expressions would differ for them. So for some, movements are massive, for some are really small, some are quite energetic in the way they speak, and some are quite mellow and quite musical in the way they speak, and all of that comes into play. So very much in my body as well. It makes it quite much more difficult during the lockdown on the internet. I find that I'm not quite as able to be as big, because you just have to kind of focus yourself, and otherwise it's a bit overwhelming. But otherwise, in a live audience, I'm very much kind of, you know, jumping up, going down, big and small, and playing with that. And it's really helpful to know beforehand, or even to see. I think you can see if somebody is not engaging with the story as much, and actually what do they need from me to be able to enjoy it as much as I can give them, to be part of it. And recently I went to visit my sister who, 7 months ago, I went to visit my sister who lived in Berlin for a time, and she took me to see a storytelling performance. She's not so much into storytelling, but I was absolutely delighted. And it was in German, and I thought it will be fine because we can understand. And interestingly enough, it was an Irish story. It was Doris Finmacall. But actually I didn't understand anything. And it was because the storytellers, you can kind of hear the poetics in her voice, but there was no movement, there was no characterization, there wasn't any of that. And it's kind of hearing other people laugh and hearing other people gasp, and knowing that I had to pretend. And it was almost like being back to that 10, 12-year-old of not being part of the community. So I think embodiment is really important to me when telling stories.
Yeah, I can see that. It's interesting. It's because, like you say, there is a channel at which we listen to kind of like the music of something. But actually, if you want to understand the narrative, there needs to be, if the language is a barrier, there needs to be some physical embodying of it, so that you feel like you're following that.
Mm.
Yeah, That's really interesting. Cool. David, shall we hear from David? Can't even see you on my screen now.
Yeah, here I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're good. You're a little bit
All right,
crackly. I don't know if that's your mic, but just
well, it might be. I have to use my mobile because
okay.
our home computer system doesn't have a camera or nor microphone.
Cool.
So anyway, I have used storytelling on the opposite standpoint of this, like the person who has the communication challenge is telling a story to those who don't, which is very, very interesting to me. And this happened to be I was doing my medical social work, and I was working with different people who have different physical and mental and communication challenges. The agency I was working with is an independent living agency, which is staffed and run by people with disabilities. And I myself, I'm a polio survivor. So, hey, okay. And being a social worker, and there was an idea put out to have a talent show with the people who were part of the independent living center, because we also had daily living classes and, how to cook and how to shop and things like this. And it was very, very interesting because two of the people, one was deaf-blind, and I've shared this with the other people on the panel, and the other person who was in the show that I worked with had the severe cerebral palsy, with the vocal and the muscle contractures and things like that. And what I did was the woman who was deaf-blind, she had an interpreter for the deaf-blind, which I had never heard about before until I saw this. And there's a machine, it's called a teletouch. It looks like a small typewriter, and the interpreter slips their hand in a slot, and the person who is communicating types in Braille. And then their interpreter speaks and says what's going on. So we talked, the interpreter, the teller, and myself. We did a lot of coordination on this because the teller, who was deaf-blind, really, really wanted to be in this show, this talent show. So we talked about what type of a story. Now, the other thing is we have to also remember that even though there's an interpreter for her, he might have to have an interpreter also, because you get into the whole thing of performance telling and straightforward telling and blah, blah, and so forth and so on. So what we came up with was her version of Little Red Riding Hood, the story that we probably all heard. But since the woman had never seen color, had absolutely no idea what color was, she used the other senses that she had. Now remember, she was also deaf. She used taste and smell and feel in touch. So her story of Little Red Riding Hood turned out to be Warm Strawberry Jam Riding Hood, because that was a way in which she could equate the color red with the taste of strawberries. And it was very, very well received. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of practice, and we got it done. And she was just elated that people who do not have the communication or the challenge or whatever could hear her voice, so to speak. The other person I worked with had severe cerebral palsy, absolute card. You would have loved him. Scream, just hilarious. And he wanted to tell the story of how he met his girlfriend, who was able-bodied, these words and stuff. So what we did was we worked with him, and since I know CP speech, or cerebral palsy speech, I was working with him and I could understand what he was saying. And I talked with him and says, how about we do this? We bring in some pantomimists or some dancers, and we work together. So when you're telling the story, they're acting it out for the audience and behind, so they can understand what he's saying. He was elated. And that, by the way, one of the dancers became his wife. And it was a scream. He was talking about in the sidecar of his motorcycle. Yes, sidecar of a motorcycle, which is where he drove it. And he was just jumping up and down like this with the motorcycle. The audience was in stitches, just in stitches. And he had a standing ovation,
Yeah.
So that was my experience in that, in using the storytelling from the other side, shall we say.
Yeah.
At the same time, when I have told, and I tell stories from around the world, like Russia, the Middle East, Ethiopia, Greece, and I have to work with the interpreter for the hearing impaired, because there are certain words that there are no sound, no signs for. So I work with them and get them introduced to when I say Matir Zemlya Soria, moist Mother Earth, like Kebra Nagas, which is Ethiopian, things like this, so that the interpreter feels comfortable and is not put on the spot. Like, how do I sign this? And another thing that not many people in the hearing community know, and I'm not certain within the deaf community, the interpreting community, just because you're deaf in the US does not mean that you can communicate with a person who's deaf in France. Sign is different. Yes, there may be some standard universal signs that I don't know, I can't speak to. And I know it here within the US itself, there are dialectical changes. May I give an example? I'm from the Southeast, from the state of Georgia. And in the sign there, you take the R, which is the ASL, American Sign Language alphabet, is spelled on the hand, and you go, ready. Like, are you ready to go or whatever? But when I came to Texas, it changed to where it's ready. So there is a dialectical situation here. And also, American Sign Language is different in that we have a hand-spelled alphabet. We don't do, you're pointing the fingers, the joints and stuff. We actually spell out with our hands. So that was my experience there. And I have had a few experiences also when I was teaching in the higher education here. I would go into classes and I would do a lecture on the folklore and the stories of the people of the historical times or whatever. And there will be one or two deaf students. And I made certain that the interpreter stood behind me or to the side, or if I was sitting, they were standing behind me. So it's not one of these, did you get that? Blah, 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 blah. It was straightforward to the person who needed the interpreting. So that is my experience. And also our Tejas Storytelling Association, which covers the old Spanish Empire of Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, our annual storytelling festival, we have professional performance tellers that are on stage. And then there are also one or two who are deafblind. They have their interpreter with them so they can be signed into their hand. So that is my experience. And I find it quite thrilling and fulfilling. I'm not working in that area anymore. I now do storytelling with the dying. And that's a whole nother subject. So
that's a whole other Monday evening, isn't it? That's great. And so it's really interesting. I think some of the stuff that you're saying about that there are kind of two issues, aren't there? There's how do we tell in a way that is inclusive of everybody, but what are the issues around interpretation, And like you say, I mean, also in British Sign Language, there are various different dialects, And so yesterday I was involved in a poetry thing, and there was a signed poem. And one of the things in that poem was about, she said an amazing thing that had never struck me before. She said, why am I called a signer when you're not called a worder? So that tyranny of spoken language,
Interesting.
I will send you the link to that poem. But so there's an issue there around interpretation. It's if you need an interpreter to engage people, how does that translate from the storyteller? How much changes in interpretation?
And isn't there an issue? Sorry, I'm coming in before the discussion thing. I'm not talking about me here. An issue on always presenting, right? And I mean, I've done a lot of work with, or have done in the past, and still do sometimes, with adults with very extreme learning difficulties. And one group I went to for years, if you roughly break it down, it was either people on a really extreme end of the autistic spectrum who spent most of their life inside game because of the iconic images within, and the other half were adults with Down syndrome.
Yes.
And so and there they used Makaton, which is a very simple sign language. But they taught me to a great extent, because I found as I was telling, they were speaking to each other, so or doing stuff spontaneously. So like, if I use the word witch, someone would go, yeah, and someone else would go, and it would, and so they kind of took over, which was lovely, you know. And so you're almost a vehicle for them doing it, if you like. And but again, it's watching, I think, you know, it's what Sheila was saying earlier, which is watching those really small, tiny little signs, and patience.
Yes.
The last bit of that was 2 years with this group, and Justin knows the story. After 2 years, what I gave them request at the end. They could do requests, or they could tell a story themselves through the thing. And I'd always say, if they wanted to pass by, I'd say, being an audience is as important, you know, so no one felt left out. And eventually someone who had always been the audience. Now, I used to do The Old Woman, the Pig a lot, because it's kind of one of those things you can do lots of sound on and all that. And I was always with the banging of the legs. And after 2 years, when I went round with requests, a woman that had said nothing for 2 years just went bang, bang, bang on her legs. And that was her request. And from that, when we did the play, where we took one of Duncan Williams's stories and dramatized it, she could participate. She was the techie. She put the CD in. And that was enormous.
Cool.
You know, after 2 years of nothing, to get from there to actually put the CD in. And I think it's just, you know, it's actually throwing all your preconceptions out, and taking those very small little signs. Sorry, I'll shut up and let Sarah hasn't spoken yet.
Before I read Sarah, just to come back on that, and Sarah may have a take on this, that actually when sometimes we see nothing, there is an awful lot going on, you know. And I think that's the thing about us, making sure that we don't assume just because someone is non-verbal, is non-speaking themselves, that doesn't mean they're not taking in a great deal. Certainly I know, so I do a lot within autistic advocacy, and some of the advocates that I respect the most are non-speaking, but when they write, they are the most eloquent, you know, that, you know, and yet if you met them, you might assume that they had learning difficulties because of their physical constraints, you know. So it's probably just worth keeping that in mind. I wanted to get to Sarah because I wanted to hear about dancing.
Well, I think I'm going to come back on that, and it's where we situate ourselves as the teller.
Yes. And
when I left, I was still a dancer, and I was still teaching dance, and I worked with somebody called Wolfgang Stanger, who worked with just different groups. He was incredible as a teacher, and for all different disabilities, from people who had heart problems to extreme withdrawn people. And he just taught me how to start, which was to sit in a circle, to take time, to not panic when there's a pause.
Yeah.
To not panic when there's a second pause. And I think that really helped. I've worked as a teacher with under 5s, children who don't speak. And then I've worked with adults who speak another language. I worked with a group of Iranian refugee women who were very, very naughty. And I knew they were being very rude and naughty to each other sexually in the group when we're dancing. And because I could see by their gestures, their faces, the way they creased up. They never not included me. I didn't know what they were saying exactly, but I knew what they were saying. And I think there's something about dance where you do share an awful lot because we don't speak. We look for movement and we look to express the movement. I know that as now a storyteller, people trying to make me stop my little movements and things. But I go back to what Sheila said about the song. You know, I often used songs, and I have a song where the firemen all shout, and in a group where people are non-verbal, the child knows that they can shout, they make a noise because they've worked it out. Well, when we come back to that bit, there is a gesture for the shout, and the gesture accompanies the shout, and they know that they can shout. And I think that's where I start. But then also I have worked with groups of handicapped adults and children, but a lot of adults. And I always used to do a whole series at 2 or 3 weeks on telling a story without words, with gesture. And they would make it up, and so you'd work in partners and you'd copy. And you know, and gradually you'd work out that some people were thinking, you know, it would take time and the partnerships would have to work really well. And you would understand that they were talking about animals moving, or people moving were different from the animal moving. And it's about, you know, you as well as the gesture you make. And that used to be great fun and pretty, especially if you got it wrong as the person who was sitting opposite somebody who was telling their story and you told it wrong. So they tell you, no, I didn't mean that, even if they weren't going to say the word. So I think, yes. And I also, going back to be a dancer, there is a whole world of gesture that is so exaggerated, from the, ooh, I'm not going to look at you, to the use of the fan, to all the things I was taught when I was a tiny child. That we were taught positions and gesture as if we were swordsmen, I think. I used to think, you know, first position, second position is open, third position is not, fourth, you know, and then you do the fifth, and you know, yes, and that's so there is a whole thing. But you know, you do that. I think you do it in storytelling because we take the heart out, don't we? Yeah. And everybody in the room knows that we're taking the heart out, and they're there with you. I am amazed when people can sit and tell a story. What I call it.
Yes, you can. Or maybe not sit. I tell you what, I'd never sat down telling a story, and after I had pneumonia and I was in the middle of a tour, so I only took 3 days off and had to go, you know, filled myself up with antibiotics and went back on the road. But I had to learn to tell stories sitting down. It was like learning again. But what I want to come back on the, you know, on that gesture and language. And I think I was probably trained by accident when I was hitchhiking around Europe as in my misspent youth, and being in places where I wasn't speaking, and we had to work with gesture. And now I've got a little place up in quite near Bianca in Romania, and well, it's near in world terms, and I go into a local school every time I'm there, and kind of the children in the village expect it. They see me walking about, and so I'm there, and they'll run out the school and bring me in. And I tell stories in English in their English lesson, and usually there's these days there's a child is being my interpreter, one of the pupils is being the interpreter. But I try, well, one, I'm using gestures up and down because to keep, you know, a whole group interested in the wrong language, you've got to be quite dynamic. So I stomp up and down the room and point to, you know, and it's that going directly to the kids you might be losing, and doing the gestures. But also I'm kind of like the other, you know, in so much as I'm speaking in the wrong language. And so I sometimes feel like that in America. There's, there's no, it's true. I remember being at Beaumont Airport, and I was and wanted to know where the car hire was, and there was a cop in. She's laying down in the sun, and excuse me, could you tell me where the rental is? And she, what? Excuse me, could you tell me where the rental is? And after about 4 goes, she just gave up and went back to her newspaper, thinking, "What is this Martian saying to me?" But it's that. But being conscious of being the other, and I try and throw in, I make the gesture and then try and throw in the Romanian word, and I always pronounce it wrong. Which is great because it's not great for me when I'm trying to talk, but the kids work out what it is. And so there's a kid shouts it back from the classroom, and I think it's, what everyone said is like, it's almost passing the buck, isn't it? Giving responsibility to the audience for your performance, really.
Yeah, well, it's. I think that's the thing with storytelling, isn't it? That sometimes we forget it is a co-creation, isn't it? It's not just you like telling your story; it's what the audience bring to it, and how you tell that story is always going to be different depending on who's in the audience. And I think that sort of having that awareness. I really feel that, and Nana was saying about, going to that German storyteller and not being able to understand, and actually we often don't know as tellers who's in our audience. So it's kind of our responsibility to make sure that these things are included in every time. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense to people? Because you just don't know who's going to be there. And I think that's, go Sheila.
No, I'm agreeing with you, and I'm also interested in the fact that we often don't do enough non-verbal storytelling with those that hear stories. For instance, one of the things that I did this year during this COVID time was have a multi-art storytelling program, and we had one theme, which was resilience. But we had a visual artist, we had a singer, we had a storyteller, we had, if I'd gotten a dancer, I would have had a dancer, but we had a juggler. That was hilarious. We had a juggler, and but they were all doing non-verbal things. And it was fascinating because every single one of the nonverbal things connected immediately to that theme of resilience. People got the story even when they didn't have it as the words like in a story. And Sarah, had I known you, you would have been my dancer for that time, because that's what I would have just, because I really believe that we don't do enough that sometimes we don't connect our storytelling worlds from nonverbal to verbal enough. And so we assume that it's all supposed to look like this. Yeah. And when it doesn't look like somebody standing up speaking a story, then we get confused. And yet when we put it together, story by word and the story in different ways, oh my gosh, it's so rich that I think we need to find ways to connect the two of them more often, if that makes sense. And I think that will also expand our audience. Sorry.
Yeah, it's having all those different channels so people can engage in different ways. I'm just looking something that kind of Alistair was saying in the chat about, sorry, I'm just going to read this out. It said, my colleague spoke in English as she used specific adjectives and points of connection. So this is kind of for a story in different language. And the teacher was translating as my colleague performed, and after a few minutes, one of the children just told him to stop as he was distracting from the story, and the rest of the class agreed. This really spoke to me of the power of the non-verbal narrative. So it's really interesting, isn't it, that that actually we can have lots of different kind of channels of communication so that everybody can engage in it at the level that they can do. But actually, that kind of goes back to what David was saying about if you've got an interpreter, you kind of need to work with them, because otherwise it could be actually pulling it apart. You need to be kind of on that same kind of hymn sheet, don't you, for want of a better way of putting it.
I think it's about pausing, isn't it? It's about, as storytellers, we tend to fill the gap. If we think there's a gap, we keep, and sometimes we need to stop and listen to what the audience is saying, even if it's silent, what they're saying, and then continue, because they're sending out signals all the time. And if we stop and listen, then we can build in what they're saying, especially when you're in a group, when you've got people who aren't going to say anything, but they react. If you keep talking, you're not going to see that reaction. And that might be the most important point of the story for that person who suddenly got something and they're doing something, and I need to shut up more and what.
No, you're absolutely right. Duke Ellington used to say that the beat is not where the drum hits the drum, it's the spaces in between.
Exactly. My when I first started doing stand-up, I was taught by, I don't know, some guy that does big movies now, but he said he was the first person that taught me that, you know, timing is about allowing audience time to come with you, and that's going to be different depending on who your audience is. And sometimes you are holding a pause before you say something important, so you make sure they're all there on the edge of their seats before you drop that. And sometimes you're going to say something and you know it's going to take some time to resonate, and you're going to need that space afterwards. So I think actually making sure we use silence effectively, you know, for our stories to really resonate, and also for us to take time to see what's coming back at us. So we're not just on broadcast, which I think I'm normally more on broadcast when it's a news story and my head is going, can I remember, you know, everything? But as you kind of settle into them, you can afford a bit more space, you know. I love that moment in stories when I find myself going off on a tangent. I notice things that like characters in my stories are doing that they haven't done before, you know. And that's kind of, it's being in that space where there's space for it to change and grow for the audience that's there. Does that make sense?
Yes, and there's also a time with with children, I think, is when they suddenly take your story and go with it. And exactly like you said, sometimes you stop, but sometimes they're 5 minutes behind, and suddenly they perk up. You know, oh, where's the cow? And you think, the cow? What was the cow? I've forgotten the cow. And but you know, the more liberated you can allow your audience to be, in a way, they're allowed to do that, and you respond.
And you can never predict what they're going to pick up.
Oh no!
I remember someone, you know, went back to a school after a year or something, and someone said, "Tell us a story about the avocado pear." And I thought, I don't tell a story about an avocado pear. And then I suddenly remembered there's an Anansi story that I tell that's got an avocado pear in it. And how many? It's a question for all of you, including sort of people that are not on the panel. How many of you have felt like we've had to relearn everything, and that hurry when we started doing stuff on film and on the internet and everything, we were hurrying. We'd forgotten the gaps. We'd forgotten all about that. And now, after 3 months of, you know, it's the world we live in. I'm looking at films I did at the beginning and the film I did last weekend, and there's no comparison. I'm back to silences, and I'm, you know, apart from my natural hesitation and hiccups, there were no silences in there. And I think we've all had to. It's been good for us because we've all had to relearn, like we're babies again.
It's the universal language, I think, silence. For those that can see and hear, we all understand language. In that space between words, it's when the emotions really build up. And so we can really have a chance to really reflect, and our emotions build up, and we can mirror the emotions of the audience. I think it's exactly, you know, brilliant to exercise that. And I've also seen a change in my storytelling since the lockdown and recording it and telling it in Zoom.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I just want to, it just reminds me something that you said. I once saw, it was actually in a play, but there was somebody telling a story in Icelandic. I don't speak Icelandic at all, but the story was about, I don't know if you guys know anything about Iceland, but they often have problems with the fairy stones. If the fairy stone is in the path of where you're trying to build a road, then you have to kind of build a road around it. But this guy did this incredible story, which I now realise I didn't understand a language word of, but because of the gestures of what he was doing about kind of putting the dynamite in this stone and the stone not blowing up, and then him taking that moment to like show his frustration or his sadness about it.
That's
So
exactly.
it became this incredible comic thing, because I remember somebody came in late and he went over it all again in gesture for the rest of, for the person that had come in. But that thing, like you say, the power of taking that moment to show how you feel about that thing is actually what gives the story the power.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I agree with that.
Someone
I
else is
agree.
going to say something before I kind of jump
Oh,
in.
yeah, no, this is Lucy. I was just going to say I agree with Nana about the importance of silence, and that giving you permission to think and to speak as well for your audience. And I work as a psychotherapist and a dance teacher. And one of the most powerful things that I think that I've ever said in my classes is take your story to the dance floor. And then that gives people permission to be silent, not to have. Sorry, my husband's echoing in the background because he just walked in. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so it allows people to have the space. Whoops, sorry, I'm being interrupted by my dog now. So it allows people to have the space to think and to go into their own story. Whereas if we keep talking, then it's our ideas and it's the lyrics of a song perhaps that take the person away from kind of the central part of what they need to be thinking about or working on. So I was agreeing when Sheila was talking about the importance of dance for expressing yourself, and also, it's important to be interested rather than just interesting. So as storytellers, and I'm not a storyteller myself, but if as storytellers we focus on being interested in our audience and what their process is or what's going on for them, then I think it can be much more powerful, and you become more interesting. Because if you've ever had anybody who's interested in you, you think that they're terribly interesting, even if they haven't said a word about themselves. Just they've shown interest in you.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
That's
that's a really great kind of phrase, isn't it? Being interested as opposed to interesting.
Can I ask Baden a question? You'll have to unmute yourself to answer, Baden. But given the area you work in professionally, which is probably not the easiest young people in the world to work with, do you use any? Do you use any sort of either poetry or storytelling stuff with them, even just for short moments? And
Yeah,
how do you get through?
I've not been doing that much lately, but interestingly, one of the reasons I'm here is that I did a session recently with young adults with learning difficulties and special needs. And that was a really challenging session. And I had a lot of misgivings going into it and decided, maybe foolishly in the end, that what I was going to do was a storytelling as opposed to my kind of go-to medium, which is poetry. And that given that I was going to do a storytelling, I wasn't sure how. I think you and I had a brief word beforehand. And I went with one of John's stories, the one about No Way Jose. And a lot of the conversation this afternoon and a lot of the suggestions and discussion that I've heard is actually informing my assessment of how that session went. Because I had to spend a lot of time pausing and trying to check out their reactions and working out whether the young man 2 tables back had actually fallen asleep because I was so boring, or whether, in fact, he was absorbing it all. And the fact that I wasn't getting that instant reaction that I'd normally expect to the call and response bits was just a different kind of reaction. And one of the most gratifying things about it was that persevering through to the end, by the time I got to the end of the story, and Jose got to the church and threw the doors open and said he was going to sing. And the whole congregation turned around and said, and at that point, practically all of the young people in the room were sort of banging the table and shouting along with the refrain. Even the young man who basically spent the whole session like this. And it was a real eye-opener for me that the patience and the perseverance and the kind of monitoring the audience, and not just powering through the story and worrying about trying to remember whether I'd remembered all the elements, but kind of bringing them in and asking a question here and there and waiting and going with the reaction of the one or two young people who were quite vocal. It really paid off. And it taught me a hell of a lot. I think I learned more from that one session, probably about as much about myself as anything else. So yeah, I've worked with another group of young people who were all English, all had English as an additional language. But because I was able to work with them over a period of about 10 weeks, I was able to pick the storytelling elements that I used. And that was really, really effective. And I had, you know, a couple of weeks later, children coming back, they were year 5 and 6, coming back to the session and saying they'd had stories that they'd written that they wanted to tell. And so, yeah, I've had some good experiences. There've not been many because I haven't been doing that much work, but the work I've done has been really fulfilling. Yeah.
We're going to deal with that not much work. Justin and I are on the case.
Oh no. Oh,
so
no.
I do want to come back just on one thing that Baden said, just on behalf of my fellow autists. So it's one of the things that I think is kind of really quite important to learn if you're working with autistic kids, that if we're looking at you, we're probably not listening. It's one of the things that when I realized I was autistic and first had the courage to do was to go, I remember practicing it in a workshop. It was kind of one of these professional development things, and it was, you know, be who you truly are. And I said to the people, do you mind if when you're talking, I don't look at you? And I'd had the courage to do it for the first time, and oh my God, as soon as I didn't look at people, I heard things so much better. And I think that's something that's really important to know, that if there are people like me, that's great about Zoom, I can look like I'm looking at you and I'm not. It's wonderful. But I think it's really important to know that about our autistic community, that there's a lovely cartoon which is somebody saying to an autistic kid, look at me when I'm talking to you, and they're looking down so they can hear the words, and then as soon as they look up, the words in the speech bubble change to just nonsense, because we can't actually, because we take in everything, to look at you and hear the words you're saying at the same time is incredibly hard. So if an autistic kid is not looking at you when you're storytelling, that's a great compliment, because they don't feel they have to mask for your benefit, and they're really listening. So just it's really worth knowing that, you know.
Can I just say quickly, just to throw the cat among the pigeons, that night that we spent together, Justine,
that sounds really dodgy, mate.
was the other...
Okay.
I had the privilege of actually spending an evening after a gig at Justine's place, where she very kindly allowed me to stay over. And we were up for a good couple of hours. And I learned more about people with autism in that couple of hours from Justine than I think in probably 3, 4, 5 years of research or reading. And that's the second reason why I'm here this afternoon, because I knew that this would be a really instructive and informative session. So
what did you do to annoy her to learn that much?
I'm autistic, and autism is my specialist subject, and if you get an autist on a specialist subject, we do not shut up.
Exactly.
I think, you know, I think part of, you know, the because we can't predict, especially with or what is it? There was someone, people with profound multiple learning difficulties, disability, just like everything. You don't know whether you're there in that case where you can't look at someone, or you might have someone, with, the equivalent of glue ear, where you hear where all the sounds are coming in, and it's really important to focus on them so they can see your lips. One of my kids, with a cleft palate, was there, and people would shout to him when he was playing football, and he wouldn't hear them. If he was looking at them, he heard. It wasn't the hearing that was impaired, but it's that focusing. And what we're dealing with as storytellers when we're working with those groups is that we're having to be conscious, especially when you get adults, especially, that any one of those combinations might be there. And it's kind of, and it's, and in some ways it's like remembering when your parents, and you were trying to listen to someone and your parents go, "Don't stare." And, we kind of have to be like that, and the other part of us is going, "Do stare." And it's like, and we're continuously readjusting.
I think a phrase that I often use, like if I'm training storytellers, and I know they're going to be working with a variety of different groups, is that we need to broaden our definition of what listening looks like. Because we're taught what polite listening is, but if we broaden that definition of what it looks like and what's listening look like for the audience we happen to be telling to and the different individuals in that audience, then we can feel more whether we're including them or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a tag phrase. That's a book, isn't it? Broaden. What was the phrase? It was a great phrase. If we take nothing away from tonight, broaden our definition of what audience looks like.
What listening looks like.
What listening looks like. Listening looks like.
Yeah. I'm aware that we were supposed to finish 15 minutes ago. I'm good to carry on, but
are you all right, Bianca? It's just like, she's cool. That's the important thing. We've got nothing else, and who needs to go to the pub?
Who needs to go to the pub? Who needs to go to the loo?
Yeah, we've got Karen. I'm aware that sort of David and Sheila haven't said much.
I would like to interject something here, if I may. And we're talking about gesture, and we're talking about pausing, and we're talking about looking but not looking, things like this. I have been doing a lot of watching and studying hula dancers. And hulas, and it's not just women who dance hula, men dance hula also. It's a totally different situation. But their gestures, they're telling a story. And I've been able to include some of their gestures, which I know what they are, when I am telling. So when we look to dance, when we look to dance and motion and face and movement, we can pull that into our own telling also. A lot of times when you say we're talking with children, and before you do, you introduce the story, like, I'm going to tell you a story that comes from the South Asian islands. Let's learn the movement for stars. And they all do it together. And then when you come up into that in the story, you're moving, but they're moving the stars also. So it becomes a teaching moment, a learning experience, and it's loads of fun. And a lot of the times the kids will break down and do hysterical laughter, but we know it happens like that. And another thing about looking but not looking, I don't know about any of y'all, but my undergraduate major was theater. And we were taught when we were in production, you don't look at the audience, you look at the very back. But the people think you're looking at them, and you listen while you're looking but not looking. So a lot of times when people believe that I'm looking directly at them when I'm telling, I'm actually looking at the back wall. It's all a matter of illusion of sight. That's how I look at it right there. That's how I see it. I haven't had the honor of working with autistic children or autistic adults. I would love to know more about that. So if you can lead me to any type of information, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I will. So at the moment, I am on a Discord with which is like another kind of social media with a whole bunch of autists who are amazing. I'm trying to. I don't know much about kind of if there's much work around autism and storytelling and kind of the impact of it, other kind of from my own personal experience being autistic myself. But I can certainly. I will. I'm going to speak to like some of the autists on there, and
Okay.
some. I mean, we had a lovely session on the conference I was at where we did what we call lightning talk. So it's 3 minutes to kind of talk about anything that you're passionate about, which you can imagine as autists. It's like but I was really moved by there was a person who did a speech using AAC. So they have an iPad to communicate, and they did a whole speech based on that, and I'm really fascinated to talk to the AAC users and go, how do you tell stories if that's how you communicate? Because my daughter is just learning to use AAC now, and I think it's a whole different way of using language, and it's a whole different way of accessing it, and to actually try and have a conversation with those autists, you know, and anyone that's using AAC, to say, as a storyteller, how do I include you with that, you know, and how do I include your language like device with that, you know, because with my daughter, you know, we kind of have stuff that we press, so when we're reading books we press stuff on there, but though she's communicating entirely through musical books at the moment, and she has a Christmas songs book, so she's just, our house is full of Christmas songs. It's a whole different way of communicating. Sheila, yeah.
Justine, I was going to thank you for letting me have my moment. And so my grandson is autistic. And I have found that this new world that we're in has been much better for our communication, mostly because he's not afraid that grandma is going to reach out and hug him at any point in time. And, you know, because grandma just wants to reach out and hug you and love you. And he's like, you know, not required, still like you, don't require that. But I really didn't understand that until we started having conversations once a week on and those times became so important. And so I would say, you know, tell me, you know, give me an animal and I'll tell you a story. And so you give me an animal and I tell him a story. And we ended up having those, you know, 20 to 30 minute conversations that we have. But he feels so much more comfortable in that. And not only that, when we did finally get to see each other again, he felt still comfortable because we had established something away from us. And even I was able to, when accidentally, we were looking at something together and I put my arm around him. I said, "Oh, I apologize. I didn't ask your permission." And he said, "You may do that right now." And it was, you know, but it was I'm finding that and I've had a friend of mine who has been working with some autistic young people, and they have loved this. And what she says is, as much as you all might find it very different and difficult, understand there's a whole group of students that absolutely love that that their communication level is now the communication level that everybody else has to do. That for them, this is comfortable and feels good and we like it, and they're thriving. They're thriving in this world that so many of us are just like, get me out of it. They're like, no, this is awesome. Thank you for talking in my way. So I just thought that was really interesting about my own. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting because obviously as autists, we have a lot of different kind of needs. I think there are definitely a lot of autists like me that have enjoyed being able to be able to focus on either performance or conversations without all of the sensory input that we're normally coping with as well. So I've certainly for myself found interaction much less exhausting, you know, and that's great. I also teach improv online, and it's quite funny because all the non-autistic, all my non-autistic students said, "Oh, it's really hard on Zoom. We don't get all the social nuance and the body language that we normally read." And I'm just like, welcome to my world. We've now leveled the playing field. How this is for you, this is how it is for me all the time, you know. But there are also some autists who have really struggled with it because the nature of autism is that we are more different to the norm. So in my house, I'm somebody who needs kind of less input, but I have two children who need more input. So we have kids that like to make noise and people in our house that like quiet. So it's a real challenge. So for those that are what sometimes people call sensory seekers, they're not getting as much input as they need. So it's kind of, for some of us, it's been bliss. For some, it's been more of a challenge. So, and it's just, I think that's the thing. If one thing to understand about autistic people is that we're just more different to the norm than you might think, and it might be hypo or hyper. It might be kind of less or more, but really, it's just about talking to the autist in question and finding out. And if you're telling, you've got people like that in an audience, and you're telling, it's kind of about observing, and trying to sense, like, is this too much or too little? Like, I will now say I have things in some of my stories, or some of you will know, where it's designed to make you jump, or there's a big bit of shouting, and then and recently, because that's okay for me, but I will often say to kids now, if noise is a problem, hands over your ears now, so that they know, so that nobody kind of, because the last thing you want is a kid who's very hypersensitive to suddenly have a meltdown and lose it. So it's kind of about making those, for people that have sensory differences, having an awareness of that and just giving them a chance to mitigate it for themselves, I think.
Did Hannah, I think, had her hand up just now.
Did you, Hannah? Sorry, I can't see you.
Yeah, she's only on sound, I think.
Hannah, speak to us.
Sorry, it's feeding time in our house, so I'm blocking out my family. You don't want to see the meeting. No, I didn't have my hand up. I was just applauding. It was an applause sign, John, saying how wonderful this discussion is.
Well, the world is continuously in translation, so I'm terribly sorry. But I mean, I think it has, and probably loads of tellers have got little bits going on, and some of us are undiagnosed, and we would hate to think we were that.
There's a lady in Seattle called Carol Gray who's been terribly successful with something called social stories, which have been specifically written for children who are on the autistic spectrum. And they're primarily viewed as a method to help children to learn how to fit into regular society. But they're also really, really helpful for helping children to learn one of the things that's really, really difficult, which is looking at somebody else's mind. So some people call autism mind blindness, because one of the major
very cross about that as a community.
Yeah. Well, somebody at Cambridge University called Baron Cohen, who's actually the cousin of Sacha Baron Cohen, the comedian, he uses that term, and I guess in his research circles it's very helpful. And not everybody is completely blind to other people, what's going on in other people's minds. But I think there is a truth that, quite a lot of people find it difficult to put themselves into the shoes of another person and really feel how that other person is feeling, or imagine what's going on with them. So it's some people view it as a difficulty with having a very broad imagination in terms of looking at other human beings' motivations. And I have to say, I've done a lot of work with autistic children and adults, and we have family members who are definitely on the autistic spectrum. And I've found that quite a helpful thing to look at. Sorry, John, were you saying something?
Well, I was going to say that some of us, because some people who look at continuously view the world in translation, for want of a better phrase, have found it really useful with our work. Not that we, I mean, I've done a lot of work in prisons over the years, about 30 odd years of working in prisons, and Justine's done some with me recently, and it's not just a matter of trying to understand other people. It's just the assumption that there's loads of people that are seeing the world in translation, and so not to assume anything. Um, so, pardon?
Can I butt in just quickly? Sorry, I had two sounds going on at once. So so there is an amazing autistic researcher, Damien. I want to say Milton, but I can't remember. But he talks about the double empathy problem. So I have to say that Baron Cohen is not a popular figure in the autistic community. In fact, there's quite a lot of satirization, shall I say, of his views of autists. But actually, if you look at Damien's work, who was at this conference, he talks about the double empathy problem, in that it's not that that neurotypical people who are not autistic misunderstand us as much as we misunderstand them. And his research showed that when autistic people talk to autistic people, the communication is fine. When neurotypical people talk to neurotypical people, it's not quite as good as autist-autist communication, but it's pretty much there. And the complications come when autistic people and neurotypical people try to communicate. Now, Baron Cohen, being a neurotypical person, described that as our deficit. Damien's work kind of shows in his research that actually it's a double empathy problem, and that for me is really fascinating. So, sorry, someone's selling a cup at this thing called Baron Cohen's Tears. So he's a very controversial figure for autists.
Well, that's a shame. I used to work with him, and he was one of the nicest people that you could ever meet, and he dedicated his life to trying to find ways of helping people who had autism. I'm sure, you know, he's very, very well respected at Cambridge University, and he's got a department there.
Yeah, I'm a psychology graduate, so I know a lot about him. And I think it is that, you know, there's something that I'll happily share with you some of the amazing academic papers that have come out from autistic researchers, because actually a lot of research, even Baron Cohen's research, who is, you know, I know that he's very sympathetic, but actually he's still coming at observing from a neurotypical perspective, and a lot of the neuro research is actually understanding things from an autistic perspective, and it's, you know, and it's amazing stuff. You know, it's really trying to understand why we are constantly viewed as the not quite the normal, and social stories can be actually quite, you know, neurotypically biased, because they're trying to get us to be neurotypical. And if you want a giggle, there is an amazing Facebook page called The Neurotypical Wife, and she writes things, social stories for neurotypical people. We had a panel at the conference about Ask a Neurotypical, which was, you know, the reverse of what normally happens, ask an autistic what it's like to be an autistic. And the autistic community has an amazing sense of humour around it, but it's actually, when you flip it on its lid, you realise that actually our world is just, it's just a completely different way of seeing things, and neurotypical society looks as odd to us as it does the other way around. And if both groups realise they're actually on an equal level, one's not worse, it's just we're in the minority, then those interactions become quite interesting, about what can we learn from each other about the way our different brains work, and how can we work together on that, as opposed to trying to help us be more neurotypical, which I don't think many autists particularly want to be, once we realise just the great potential of who we are. But Lucy, I'll share with you.
But it's into society, isn't it? Because you know, so many people are you know, not able to access the world of work. I think it's something like 90% of people who have a diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder are not in employment. So I think sometimes, you know, and also the suicide rate amongst young men who are diagnosed with autism, or autistic spectrum disorder rather, sorry, the rate is incredibly high, you know, frighteningly
we
high.
are, as an autistic,
trying to,
we're 8 times more likely to commit suicide than...
Yeah, so I think it is important to try to help those people who want to, or those people who feel a need to try to access the world of work, and access the primarily neurotypical world that we live in, while still saying, we're great, everybody's individuals, and we're all great.
Yeah, so there's two, just to come back on that, so it's not saying that we wouldn't do that. We absolutely want access to work. I think there's two ways of going at it. There's either we make us more neurotypical in order to fit in, and therefore do that, but that has mental health implications on us, or we work with the employers and we find different ways of making the very small adjustments that make it possible for us. And actually there's some really interesting research about how you structure employment practices so that they are inclusive to everybody. And one of the great research always says that what's good for autistic people is good for all people, because it's about clearer communication and stuff. So all of those things, I say, I'm an autistic advocate, so I've got, I've written loads on why our suicide rate is higher. I'm 47 and our average life expectancy is in the 50s, so that's a massive problem for us. But how we go about dealing with that, it could be, what's happened is so far is that it's about trying to help us be more neurotypical. But what has been found is that when we do that, there are severe mental health implications for us, and that's one of the reasons for the suicide rate. Whereas when we work with people and try and help them understand what we need in order to be able, for our disability, and the same as somebody who has a wheelchair needs a wheelchair to be there, if we can make those accommodations and be autistic in the workplace and be autistic in whatever we need, then we are able to access those work opportunities, reduce our mental health problems, all of that without having to force ourselves to be something we're not, and the mental health implications of that, which I think it's just that people haven't understood that yet. And we're right at the, there's some amazing research around it.
I think at the moment we're even further behind. We're seeing, for adults especially, people don't even recognize it. And I've come across this a lot in prison. And there was one guy I worked with a lot. No one would have him in. He'd been kicked out of education. If you're kicked out of education in prison, there's not many places to go except John Rose, whatever, lunatic workshop. I got a lovely message from someone this week saying, thank you. I've worked with him 20 years ago, and he thanked me for keeping him sane by my rather insane methods. But the thing that sticks out much more seriously, I worked with one guy, and what the rest of the prison saw was 30 to 40-year-old big black guy, and they just put him down as aggressive. And and every step, it didn't matter how many notices there were around the prison saying if something is perceived to be racist, it is racist, and all that sort of thing. All what people were seeing was that stereotype. And I thought, you're on the spectrum, mate. So for instance, so he come into the play, and we always did the plays in the chapel because they had the best acoustics, and there's always a chapel orderly, and they're quite robust because everyone wants to con them, and they'd make coffee, but you kind of had to be polite. And Jesse knows this story, and so he'd come in and he'd say, "Give me a cup of coffee," because that was what he wanted, and why would you want to say anything else? And of course, the answer he got was to do with sex and travel, and so I kind of took him aside and said, maybe if you, not that he had any reason to do this, but if to get the cup of coffee, which is the thing that was needed, maybe if you came in and said, "Good morning, how are you? Please, can I have a cup of coffee?" You might get a cup of coffee. So the next morning you came in and said, "Good morning, how are you?" And it's just a matter of picking, not just, but I'm thinking, I'm not trained. I'm just some hottest geezer. And there's and if I can pick it up, why aren't all these professionals picking it up? And participation in the play.
Because you're one of us, John.
Actually, can I?
I'm undiagnosed.
Can I very quickly? Yeah, coming in on John's point and actually going back to something that you said earlier about the young man sitting in the room and the fact that that person's not making contact. That actually means that they're listening.
Yeah.
It's an issue that's going to come up every now and again when you do certain workshops where the organizers offer you a profile of the potential attendees. And I've got a real issue with that. My issue being sometimes a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing, and no knowledge at all can be even more dangerous. And I often wonder, is it better to get that information, have a look at it, and then try and spend some time understanding what it means, which is not my preferred starting position, or just go in there, meet the group of individuals, and then proceed and deal with who and what you find and puzzle your way through?
Sheila, do you want to come back on that? I see your hand.
I will, and I do agree that a little bit of information is a bad thing. And I think our friend Sarah is about to go, so we'll just say goodbye, Miss Sarah. Amen. It's good to see you. So good to
Sarah,
see
it's been lovely. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
So I have found when I working inside the schools, as I was, that when I first started working inside the school, I was like, oh, don't make the students anything different. Have them come in, you know, just with everybody else. It didn't take me but a year to figure out what I wanted to do was have any child that had special needs or that would be considered special needs to come in first for two reasons. One, if they came in second, they always sat in the back. They always made them sit away as if they would be taken out and whisked out without having the opportunity to be able to do anything to say that they could stay. And then secondly, when they came in even 5 to 10 minutes before everybody else came in, 5 to 7 minutes before everybody else came in, I could do something with them I couldn't do with anybody else. And that was let them hear my voice, to get a chance to hear what my voice is going to sound like in their ear, give them the opportunity to make to give me cues as to when I'm too loud or when they need to hear me more. I was like, if I go too loud, like if I get up here, you can go, and I'll be okay with that. And if I get too soft and you can go, and I give them these cues. I also would let them know that that I would love their participation in any manner. When there's time for participation, I'm going to ask for their participation, and their participation is just as much important. And then they sat up front, which meant all the kids who came in behind them realized that the most important people in that room were the people that had already come in first. So their reaction to the kids that came in first. And what I found is that that was a brilliant strategy, if I must say so myself. It was a brilliant strategy, and really changed it for everybody. So if there was a child that said, I don't feel comfortable up here, they could go to the back, and that was fine, and I would know. But the teachers and the kids knew that this was a way for me to include them. So when I do it like that, so I don't just want a piece of paper, I want you to let me talk to them before thank you, this is a great piece of paper. I want to talk to them before we go on the stage. And it changed everything for the way that I do stuff. And then I have those children are responding, as actively as anybody else is responding. And what I've also found out, it teaches the teachers. It teaches those that are in charge that their kids could actually be a part of this. Whereas when they're coming in and sitting in the back, they're only doing it most of the time because they want to give them exposure, but they're not necessarily expecting them to be taught or to be an active part. If that makes sense.
It does. And not only that, I think, Justin, I don't know about you, but we've been we have, as I said, been rattling on between us. The most productive thing, and I think Sheila, that really clear hint from Sheila at the end is just a lovely one to finish the whole thing on. So Justine, I've got to thank you for sort of chairing this, and so if we have a round of applause for Justine and putting us all together, and thank you to all our guests and the people who've contributed, and of course Bianca, for whom it's now about 3 o'clock in the morning or something. Sorry, Bianca.
It's not so late.
And Abdul and Suha down in Morocco, trying to, all the people that work with us. But it's been a fantastic session. I got to thank you, and I'm just, Sheila, we're going to talk about a date because I really want a whole program of you at some point.
Yes, sir.
But next Monday, and I haven't set this up, I'm looking for sort of 12 tellers from around the world for a 5-minute story. So just come in so we can travel the world with 5-minute stories. Now I'm looking for about 12 tellers. Well, you know, or we just open it up and I just look on who's there and just pick them out. But if I've got some idea of who's going to turn up, that'd be fantastic. That's next Monday at the same time. And thank you all, and a round of applause for all of you.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you, Justine.
Thank you, Justine. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Justin.
Thanks,
Brilliant evening.
Justine. Nice
Thank
to
you.
meet you, Sheila. Thanks, Nana.